I hired a furnace repair technician while my wife was supposedly in Hawaii. An hour after he arrived at my house, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Gallagher, there is a locked door hidden behind your winter storage shelves. Who is inside?" Confused, I replied. "What door? We do not have any locked rooms in the basement." His next message sent me sprinting to my car. "Sir, I can hear weak breathing coming from inside, and there are 4 heavy padlocks securing it from the outside. I have already called the police. Before I tell you what they found behind that wall, let me know where you are watching this story from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a terrifying secret about someone you loved." My name is George Gallagher. I am 64 years old, and for the past 30 years I have poured my sweat, blood, and sanity into building one of the most successful freight logistics companies on the East Coast. I am a man who deals in cold, hard facts. I track supply chains. I monitor international cargo routes. I know when a single wooden crate is missing from a shipping manifest. So when hundreds of thousands of dollars began quietly bleeding out of my personal offshore accounts 3 weeks ago, I did not confront my family immediately. I did what I have always done when I spot a leak in the system. I hired a professional. His name was Gavin, a highly discreet private investigator with a stellar reputation for tracking digital ghosts and untangling corporate fraud. 2 weeks ago, Gavin stopped returning my calls. I assumed he had simply taken my heavy cash retainer and run. I never imagined the horrifying truth was buried directly beneath my own feet. The drive back to my sprawling colonial home in the quiet suburbs felt like a fever dream. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. My wife Cynthia had left 5 days ago for a 2-week luxury wellness retreat in Maui. She had packed her designer luggage, kissed my cheek with that perfectly practiced hollow smile, and told me not to worry about a single thing while she was gone. Cynthia and I had been married for 30 years, a union that looked completely flawless on the outside, but had grown increasingly cold and transactional on the inside. I thought her worst sin was vanity and an obsession with country club status. I was catastrophically wrong. When I turned onto my street, my heart plummeted into my stomach. 2 police cruisers were already parked in my driveway, their red and blue lights throwing harsh, frantic shadows across the manicured lawn. I paid a landscaper a fortune to maintain. I threw my car into park, barely turning off the engine, before I was sprinting toward the open front door. A young police officer tried to stop me at the threshold, but I pushed past him, my voice booming with an authority I had honed over decades in ruthless corporate boardrooms. I told him it was my house and demanded to know what was going on. Detective Vargas, a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, met me at the top of the basement stairs. He held up a hand, his face grim and pale. He asked if I owned the property, and when I confirmed I did, his gaze hardened into a glare. He told me to brace myself and led me down the wooden steps into the cavernous basement. The air down there was incredibly thick, smelling of old dust, damp concrete, and something sharp and metallic. My basement was supposed to be a mundane space. It was half-finished, holding seasonal decorations, old tax records in plastic bins, and the main HVAC unit. But the space behind the heavy metal storage racks had been completely altered. The technician who had texted me was standing nervously in the far corner, clutching his canvas tool bag to his chest. He had moved a massive floor-to-ceiling shelving unit to access the blocked furnace vents. Behind where that shelving unit usually stood, the drywall was wrong. It was a false wall. Someone had meticulously installed heavy-duty hinges and a seamless cut into the plaster, creating a thick, reinforced steel door that blended perfectly into the gray background when closed. My breath caught in my throat. I had walked past that wall 100 times fetching holiday lights or golf clubs. I never noticed the slight seams. I never noticed the microscopic scratches on the concrete floor, where the heavy door dragged when it swung open. But what made my stomach violently churn were the locks. 4 heavy-duty industrial-grade padlocks secured thick steel hasps on the outside of the door. Whatever or whoever was inside was never meant to get out. Detective Vargas signaled to two burly officers carrying massive yellow bolt cutters. The metallic snapping sound of the hardened steel locks giving way echoed through the basement like gunshots. With every lock that fell heavily to the concrete floor, a new wave of absolute terror washed over me. I thought about Cynthia. I thought about the thousands of dollars missing from my accounts. I thought about her strange, aggressive insistence that she needed the house entirely to herself for a full week before her Hawaii trip to supposedly organize her charity donations. It was all a meticulously crafted lie to buy herself time. The final lock hit the ground. Detective Vargas drew his sidearm and signaled for the officers to pull the heavy door open. The thick steel hinges groaned in loud protest. The space revealed behind the drywall was an absolute nightmare. It was a small, windowless subcellar, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were lined with thick, expensive acoustic soundproofing foam. It was the exact kind of high-grade foam that ensures not a single scream could ever reach the hardwood floors above. The air inside was foul, thick with the stench of sweat, absolute fear, and human waste. In the center of the dark, cramped room, illuminated only by the harsh beams of the police flashlights, was a heavy wooden chair. Bound to that chair with thick nylon zip ties was a man. His head slumped forward, his clothes completely soiled and torn. His face was badly bruised, his lips cracked and bleeding from severe, prolonged dehydration. When the blinding light of the flashlights hit his face, he let out a weak, ragged groan, trying to turn his head away from the glare. I stepped forward, pushing past the officers, my entire world collapsing into a singular, horrifying focal point. It was Gavin, the private investigator I had secretly hired to track my missing corporate funds. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and erratic, his chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. The paramedics rushed down the stairs, pushing past us to reach him. They immediately began cutting the thick plastic ties binding his wrists and ankles, shouting medical codes to each other in the cramped space. Gavin slumped forward into the arms of a paramedic, his eyes rolling back in his head. But just before he lost consciousness completely, his bruised, swollen eyes locked onto mine. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked terrified. I stood frozen in the doorway of that soundproofed torture chamber built inside my own home. My mind raced, piecing together the horrifying timeline. Gavin had disappeared right after he left me a voicemail, saying he had found a massive breakthrough regarding my offshore accounts. Cynthia had suddenly demanded I stay at my downtown corporate apartment that exact same week due to a supposed toxic plumbing issue at the house. She had the time. She had the stolen funds to buy the materials. She had the motive. Detective Vargas turned to me, his notebook in hand, asking me if I knew the man in the chair. I looked at the acoustic foam on the walls. I looked at the heavy steel door. I thought about my wife sipping expensive cocktails on a sun-drenched balcony in Maui, pretending to be on a spiritual wellness retreat, while a man slowly died of thirst directly beneath our kitchen. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing. Cynthia had not just stolen my money. She had built a black site prison in our basement. She had kidnapped a man who was getting too close to her secrets. She was fully prepared to let him die in the dark to protect her lavish lifestyle. I realized in that suffocating, horrible moment that the woman I had slept next to for 30 years was a cold-blooded monster. But as I watched the paramedics carefully carry Gavin up the stairs on a stretcher, a cold, highly calculated calm washed over me. I was a man who spent his entire life fixing broken logistical systems, and my family was fundamentally, violently broken. I would not panic. I would not call her and demand answers. I would let her believe she had won right up until the exact moment I destroyed her completely. The hospital room felt colder than the basement. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside the hospital bed, watching the slow rise and fall of the chest of Gavin. His face was a patchwork of deep purple bruises and swollen skin. The doctors had stabilized him, pumping him full of intravenous fluids to reverse days of severe dehydration. When his eyes finally fluttered open, they were bloodshot and frantic. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, producing only a harsh scraping sound. I poured a small amount of water into a plastic cup and held the straw to his cracked lips. He drank greedily, then grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for a man who had nearly died in my sub-cellar. He did not ask for this police. He pulled me closer, his breath smelling of copper and decay. He whispered that I needed to look inside the plastic evidence bag resting on the small table at the foot of his bed. The nurses had placed his personal effects there when they stripped off his soiled clothes. I walked over my hands, completely steady despite the hurricane of emotions tearing through my mind. Inside the clear bag, stuffed deep inside the toe of his mud-stained shoe, was a small black USB drive. The casing was cracked, likely stepped on during the struggle, but the metallic connector remained intact. I slipped it into my pocket. Gavin coughed a wet, rattling sound and looked directly into my eyes. He told me that my wife did not build that room by herself. He told me she did not catch him alone. He had cracked the encryption on the personal desktop computer of Cynthia in her home office. He was downloading her private financial ledgers when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to find not just my wife, but my entire family standing in the doorway. My blood turned to ice as Gavin gasped out the names. Brian, my ambitious son. Amanda, his perfectly manicured wife. Rachel, my beloved daughter. And Scott, her charismatic husband. They had all cornered him. They had all dragged him down those stairs to rot in the dark. I left the hospital room and walked straight to my car parked in the designated visitor lot. I retrieved my heavily encrypted work laptop from the trunk, a machine designed to protect corporate logistics routes from international hacking. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine off the air inside the cabin growing stagnant. I plugged the cracked USB drive into the port. A small light flickered on the device. It was fully functional. I opened the main directory, and my entire reality shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The files were a masterclass in financial butchery. Spreadsheets, wire transfer receipts, offshore account routing numbers, and forged authorization forms. I watched my life work, the wealth I had built over 40 years of grueling labor, being systematically dismantled and drained. Cynthia had not just been skimming off the top to fund her luxury shopping habits. She was the architect of a massive embezzlement ring, and my children were her eager accomplices. I opened a folder labeled with the name of Brian. My son, the golden boy who claimed his tech startup was on the verge of a billion-dollar buyout, was completely bankrupt. The files showed Brian and Amanda had secretly leveraged my primary logistics company to secure millions of dollars in high-interest venture capital. The credit card statements of Amanda were attached, showing sickening amounts of money dropped on designer clothing, luxury cars, and exclusive country club memberships, all funded by the quiet bleeding of my assets. I clicked on the folder belonging to Rachel. My little girl, the one I had walked down the aisle just 5 years ago, was drowning in a nightmare of her own making. Scott, her husband, had accumulated catastrophic debts in illicit offshore betting rings. The ledgers showed Rachel siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from my personal retirement accounts, routing the money through complex shell companies to pay off the violent bookies of Scott. They were all parasites feeding off my hard work while smiling in my face at every Sunday dinner. But the financial treachery was nothing compared to the contents of a folder Gavin had ominously named medical. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside were scanned pages of laboratory reports, toxicology screenings, and encrypted email exchanges between Cynthia and a foreign supplier. For the past 8 months, Cynthia had been bringing me a small porcelain cup every morning, filled with water and 2 large opaque capsules. She told me they were special imported supplements, a holistic remedy she found to help with the joint pain in my knees. I took them faithfully, trusting the woman I had married. The lab results Gavin had managed to intercept told a completely different story. The capsules did not contain herbal supplements. They contained a highly concentrated, slow-acting heavy metal. It was a rare, nearly untraceable neurotoxin designed to accumulate in the bloodstream over time. The side effects were perfectly masked as natural aging: fatigue, shortness of breath, joint pain, and eventually catastrophic heart failure. I read the chemical breakdown, my eyes burning, as the horrifying truth settled into my bones. My wife was slowly, methodically murdering me every single morning. I looked at my hands resting on the steering wheel. The slight tremor I had attributed to getting older was not age at all. It was the poison coursing through my veins, destroying my nervous system from the inside out. Cynthia had watched my health deteriorate day by day, feigning concern, rubbing my shoulders, while secretly calculating how many days I had left to live. She had even scheduled fake doctor appointments to keep up appearances for our friends and neighbors. The level of sociopathic detachment required to look a man in the eyes while actively killing him was something I could barely comprehend. Brian and Rachel knew. The encrypted chat logs left no room for doubt. There were messages from Brian complaining about how long the process was taking, whining that his creditors were threatening to seize his assets. Rachel had responded with cold reassurance, telling her brother to be patient, that their mother promised the final dose would happen before her flight to Maui. My own flesh and blood had reduced my life to a ticking countdown on a financial spreadsheet. I opened the final email exchange. Cynthia had carefully calculated the dosage to ensure the toxin would reach a fatal threshold precisely this week. Suddenly, her luxurious wellness retreat in Hawaii made perfect, terrifying sense. It was never a vacation. It was a bulletproof alibi. She had planned to be thousands of miles away, sipping expensive champagne on a tropical beach, surrounded by witnesses, while my heart stopped beating in my sleep. My children would discover the body, shed their fake tears at my funeral, and immediately divide my plundered empire among themselves. I closed the laptop. The silence inside my car was absolute. A normal man would have broken down. A normal man would have called the police, handed over the laptop, and let the authorities arrest his family. But I was not a normal man. I had spent decades anticipating supply chain disasters, outmaneuvering corporate rivals, and eliminating threats with cold, calculated precision. The grief that should have paralyzed me evaporated, replaced by a dark, consuming clarity. I thought about the thousands of mornings I had kissed my wife, the tuition I had paid for my children, the business I had built to ensure their futures were secure. They looked at my generosity and saw only weakness. They looked at my love and saw an opportunity for a slaughter. They believed they were hunting a tired, oblivious old man. They had no idea they had just awakened a monster who knew exactly how to dismantle their lives piece by piece. I stepped out of the hospital room and found Detective Vargas standing in the pale, sterile corridor. The detective was scrolling through his mobile phone, likely preparing to file the official dispatch report that would blast the raid of my basement across local police scanners and public records. I walked up to him and gently placed my hand over the screen of his device. I did not speak with the frantic panic of a victim. I spoke with the low, resonant gravity of a man who commanded international shipping fleets and controlled thousands of employees. I told Vargas that if a single squad car reported to my address on the official record, the people responsible would know their trap had been breached. I explained that my wife and my children were not just attempting murder, but were actively operating a highly sophisticated embezzlement ring tied to offshore accounts, venture capital fraud, and heavy metal toxins. If they caught wind of a local police investigation, they would destroy the digital ledgers, liquidate the stolen assets, and vanish before the sun came up. I asked the detective for 48 hours of absolute silence. I told him to classify the basement extraction as an off-the-books federal fraud operation to protect the integrity of a massive financial probe. Vargas looked deeply into my eyes. He saw the cold, unyielding certainty of a man who was fully prepared to dismantle his own bloodline. The detective slowly lowered his phone and nodded his agreement. The official record would show nothing. My house was a ghost town once again. I walked out of the hospital and drove my vehicle back to my sprawling suburban estate. The streets were quiet, lined with towering oak trees and pristine lawns. It was the picture of the perfect American dream, a dream I had financed with 40 years of grueling, relentless labor. When I unlocked the front door, the silence of the empty house hit me like a physical weight. The air smelled of the expensive lavender candles Cynthia always kept burning in the foyer. I walked through the main hallway, running my fingers along the imported mahogany console table and the custom-framed family portraits on the walls. I looked at the smiling faces of my son Brian and my daughter Rachel in their graduation gowns. I looked at Cynthia with her arms wrapped around my waist during our anniversary trip. The anger that should have broken my heart was completely gone. What replaced it was a chilling, absolute detachment. I was no longer a father or a husband. I was a corporate auditor, and my family was a catastrophic liability that needed to be liquidated immediately. I bypassed the kitchen and walked directly down the hardwood stairs into the basement. The space behind the heavy storage shelves was a chaotic mess of severed steel and scuffed concrete. The paramedics had left discarded medical wrappers and muddy boot prints across the floor. I took off my suit jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and went to work. I found a pair of thick rubber gloves in my utility drawer and grabbed a bucket of industrial bleach. I scrubbed the floor on my hands and knees, wiping away every single trace of the rescue operation. I righted the heavy wooden chair in the center of the soundproofed subcellar where Gavin had been tied. I smoothed out the indentations on the thick acoustic foam walls. I gathered the heavy broken pieces of the original padlocks the police had destroyed with their bolt cutters. I threw them into a heavy trash bag and hid them beneath a pile of old paint cans in the far corner of the utility room. I left the basement and drove my truck to a massive hardware superstore on the commercial edge of town. I walked down the security aisle and located the exact brand and model of the heavy-duty padlocks Cynthia had used to seal that steel door. I purchased 4 of them, paying in cash to ensure there was no digital paper trail linking me to the transaction. When I returned home, I moved the massive storage shelving unit aside, closed the thick reinforced door, and snapped the 4 brand-new padlocks onto the heavy steel hasps. The heavy metallic clicks echoed through the empty basement, sealing the illusion completely. I moved the shelving unit back into place, arranging the plastic winter storage bins exactly as they had been before the police arrived. I stepped back and examined the wall. It was flawless. Cynthia could walk down those stairs, look behind those shelves, and believe her secret prison was completely undisturbed. She would believe the private investigator she locked away was still rotting in the dark while she sipped cocktails in Hawaii. With the basement perfectly secured, I walked upstairs to the master bathroom. The pristine marble countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting. Beside the brushed nickel sink sat the small porcelain cup and the amber glass bottle containing my daily supplements. This was the bottle Cynthia insisted I take every single morning for my aging joints. I picked up the bottle, feeling the smooth glass against my palm. Inside were the opaque capsules containing the slow-acting, heavy metal neurotoxin meant to slowly stop my heart. I carried the bottle downstairs to the kitchen island. I laid out a piece of dark parchment paper on the granite surface. With surgical precision, I gently twisted the gelatin halves of the first capsule apart. A fine pale gray powder spilled out onto the paper. It looked so ordinary, so remarkably harmless. I emptied every single capsule, gathering the toxic heavy metal into a small, airtight plastic container that I sealed and hid deep inside my locked briefcase for future evidence against my wife. I went to the baking pantry and retrieved a fresh box of standard baking soda. Using a tiny measuring spoon, I meticulously filled each empty gelatin capsule with the harmless white powder. I snapped the halves back together, wiping away any stray dust with a microfiber cloth to ensure they looked untouched. The process took over an hour. It was tedious, delicate work, but I found a profound sense of satisfaction in every single capsule I rebuilt. I was literally dismantling my own murder with my bare hands. When I finished, I placed the reconstructed capsules back into the amber glass bottle. I carried the bottle back upstairs and set it exactly where Cynthia had left it, on the bathroom counter, next to her expensive facial creams. The trap was now perfectly set. My house was pristine. The basement was secure. The poison was neutralized. I stood in front of the large mirror above the bathroom sink and stared at my own reflection. I looked at the gray hair at my temples and the deep lines etched around my eyes. I looked like a tired, aging executive. I looked like a man whose body was quietly and inevitably failing him. That was exactly what my parasitic family needed to see, and I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. I would weaponize my silence. When Rachel called to ask for money, I would sound weak and compliant. When Brian came over to secure his fake investments, I would slur my words and rub my chest in fake agony. I would let them whisper behind my back. I would let them tally up their anticipated inheritance and make their lavish, fraudulent plans with my money. They believed they were brilliant architects of my demise, eagerly awaiting the final collapse of my heart. They had absolutely no idea that I had already rewritten the ending to their story, and I was going to watch them walk blindly into their own financial and legal slaughter. The morning sun spilled across the marble island in my kitchen, casting long, peaceful shadows across a house that was essentially a crime scene. I was drinking my second cup of black coffee, reviewing the encrypted files on my laptop, when the silence was shattered by the shrill ringing of my cell phone. The screen illuminated with a photograph of my daughter, Rachel. She was smiling in the picture, wearing a white sundress at a summer barbecue we hosted 2 years ago. I stared at her smiling face for a long moment, letting the reality of her betrayal settle deep into my chest. According to the ledgers Gavin had risked his life to extract, Rachel had already siphoned over $300,000 from my retirement portfolio to cover the disastrous financial mistakes of her husband. Now, with my supposed death fast approaching, I knew she would be desperate to extract one final massive payout before the estate was locked in probate. I cleared my throat, lowered my shoulders to physically manifest the exhaustion I needed to project, and answered the call. Before I could even offer a greeting, the sound of frantic manufactured sobbing filled my ear. Rachel was putting on an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. She gasped for air between rehearsed tears, crying out for me, calling me daddy in that small, fragile voice she used to use when she scraped her knee as a little girl. I kept my voice weak and raspy, injecting a slight tremor into my words as I asked her what was wrong. She wailed that she and Scott were in terrible trouble. She claimed they had just received a terrifying notice from the Internal Revenue Service. According to her perfectly scripted narrative, an honest accounting error from a former business partner of Scott had suddenly triggered a massive unjust tax lien. She cried that the government was threatening to seize their beautiful home in Chicago by the end of the week if they did not immediately pay $80,000 in penalties. She begged me to help them, swearing that Scott was working day and night to fix the misunderstanding. But they just needed a bridge loan to keep a roof over the heads of my future grandchildren. I sat perfectly still, listening to the desperate, trembling cadence of her voice. If I had not seen the encrypted files the night before, my heart would have broken for her. I would have moved mountains to protect my little girl. I would have wired the money without a second thought, just as I had done so many times before. But the truth was glowing in stark, undeniable spreadsheets right in front of me on my laptop screen. The government was not threatening to seize their home. The people threatening Scott were violent collectors from an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. Scott had plummeted into catastrophic debt, gambling away hundreds of thousands of dollars on international soccer matches and underground boxing rings. Rachel knew exactly where the money was going. She was not a victim of the addiction of her husband. She was his willing accomplice, actively enabling his gambling by treating my hard-earned wealth as a bottomless slush fund. They believed I was dying. They believed the heavy metals coursing through my veins were making me slow, compliant, and easily confused. They thought an $80,000 wire transfer would simply vanish into the ether, written off as the erratic generosity of a failing old man. I let a long, heavy silence stretch across the phone line. I breathed heavily into the receiver, letting out a weak, rattling cough that I knew would thrill her. I told her to calm down. I told her that my chest was aching and that the stress was making me dizzy. I heard her breath hitch a fleeting moment of panic that she might push me into a fatal cardiac event before the funds were secured. I lowered my voice to a weary, defeated whisper. I told her that I loved her, that I would never let anyone take her home, and that I would handle the $80,000 immediately. Rachel collapsed into a chorus of excessive gratitude, crying out that I was her hero, promising to pay me back every single penny. I told her she did not need to thank me, that a father always protects his family. I hung up the phone, and the pathetic, frail old man vanished instantly. My face hardened into stone. I carried my coffee into my home office, sitting down behind my heavy oak desk. It was time to give my daughter and my son-in-law exactly what they asked for, but on terms that would legally and financially decapitate them. I was not going to send a simple, untraceable wire transfer from my personal checking account. That was what they expected. That was how you lost money to ghosts. Instead, I logged into the highly secure, heavily monitored corporate escrow portal of Gallagher Logistics. I initiated a commercial wire transfer for $80,000, but I attached a formidable ironclad contingency. I utilized a specialized financial framework I had developed decades ago for high-risk corporate acquisitions. I drafted a digital document classifying the $80,000 not as a personal gift, but as a callable, high-yield commercial business loan. In the intricate legal terminology buried within the digital contract, I included a devastating collateral clause. By accepting the funds, Scott would legally bind his own personal assets, including his luxury vehicles, his remaining stock portfolios, and the very house in Chicago they claimed was under threat as direct collateral to Gallagher Logistics. Furthermore, the contract explicitly stated that the funds were to be used strictly for resolving federal tax liabilities. Routing the money to an offshore gambling syndicate under this specific commercial pretense would elevate their actions from simple domestic deceit to massive multi-tiered federal wire fraud. I attached the digital contract to an email and sent it directly to the personal inbox of Scott. I knew exactly how he operated. He was an arrogant, impulsive man currently suffocating under the pressure of violent debt collectors. He would not hire a lawyer to review a document from his dying, supposedly senile father-in-law. He would not read the fine print. He would only see the glorious saving grace of $80,000 dangling right in front of his face. I leaned back in my leather office chair and watched the tracking software on my computer screen. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The system indicated that the email had been opened. I pictured Scott sitting in his home office in Chicago, sweating his hands, shaking as he scrolled past the dense legal jargon, his eyes focused entirely on the signature box at the bottom of the page. He believed he was outsmarting a dying man. He believed he had successfully secured the cash to pay off his bookies and save his own skin. A loud, crisp chime echoed through my quiet office. The digital notification flashed bright green across my screen. Scott had signed the document. He had authorized the transfer. The $80,000 was officially released from the corporate escrow account, flying through the digital ether toward his bank in Chicago. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling a cold, predatory satisfaction settle over me. The money was gone, but it was the most lucrative investment I had ever made in my life. Scott and Rachel thought they had just secured their salvation. They had no idea they had just signed a legally binding confession to federal fraud, wrapping a financial noose securely around their own necks. I closed the laptop, the trap perfectly primed, and waited for the rest of my parasitic family to make their move. The elevator doors glided open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling penthouse office of my corporate attorney, Kenneth. The space was a fortress of polished glass, dark mahogany, and sweeping views of the city skyline. Kenneth was not just a lawyer. He was a legal predator, a man who possessed a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that pointed strictly toward the survival of his clients. We had spent decades fighting side by side in the trenches of corporate acquisitions, crushing hostile takeovers, and bleeding out rival logistics firms. When I walked into his office that afternoon, I did not need to say a single word. He took one look at my face, noted the rigid set of my jaw and the cold emptiness in my eyes, and immediately instructed his receptionist to cancel all his appointments for the rest of the day. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the cracked black drive on the smooth glass surface between us. I told him that my family was trying to kill me and that they were currently dismantling my empire while waiting for my heart to stop. Kenneth did not gasp. He did not offer useless platitudes or empty sympathy. His face hardened into a mask of pure clinical focus. He picked up the drive, plugged it into an isolated, secure terminal on his desk, and began to parse through the encrypted ledgers Gavin had sacrificed his freedom to extract. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. I watched the reflection of scrolling spreadsheets and banking codes dancing across the thick lenses of his glasses. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the rapid, aggressive clicking of his mouse. Then Kenneth stopped. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of professional disgust and deep personal anger. He told me that my daughter and her husband were just petty thieves stealing from my retirement accounts. But my son Brian and his wife Amanda had committed financial treason on a scale that was almost difficult to comprehend. Kenneth turned the monitor toward me. He pointed to a series of heavily nested digital contracts and wire transfer receipts. Brian had not just asked for a loan to fund his failing tech startup. He knew I would never finance a sinking ship. Instead, Brian and Amanda had deliberately and fraudulently leveraged the entirety of Gallagher Logistics. They had used forged executive signatures and manipulated corporate seals to pledge my primary company as collateral to a group of notoriously aggressive, high-interest venture capitalists. They had successfully secured $3 million in predatory funding. The sheer audacity of the betrayal took my breath away. Brian had bet my entire life work, every warehouse, every shipping contract, every fleet of trucks I owned on a desperate gamble to save his own dying company. And the venture capitalists, smelling blood in the water and believing they had a rock-solid claim on a highly profitable logistics empire, had gladly handed over the cash. Amanda had immediately taken a massive cut of that fraudulent capital, funneling it into her own personal accounts to maintain her lavish country club lifestyle, completely unbothered by the fact that she was actively destroying her father-in-law to pay for her designer clothes. Kenneth folded his hands on the desk. He asked me if I wanted him to call the federal authorities immediately. He reminded me that wire fraud of this magnitude, combined with forged corporate documents, would guarantee Brian and Amanda decades in a federal penitentiary. I shook my head slowly. I told Kenneth that calling the police right now would be a mercy. A sudden arrest would give them a chance to hide behind defense attorneys and plead ignorance. It would give them the opportunity to play the victim. I did not want them to go to prison while they still felt secure. I wanted them to experience the absolute crushing terror of total financial annihilation. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow them whole. I leaned forward and told Kenneth I wanted to completely separate Gallagher Logistics from the fraudulent debt my son had created. I wanted to leave Brian holding a $3 million bag of high-interest debt with absolutely no way to pay it back. A slow, dangerous smile spread across the face of my attorney. Kenneth told me it was time to execute a maneuver we reserved only for the most catastrophic corporate emergencies. We were going to perform a financial decapitation. We were going to build a hollow empire. For the next 6 hours, we did not leave that office. Kenneth summoned 2 of his most trusted junior partners, and we began the meticulous, brutal process of gutting my own company from the inside out. We established a brand new, impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust, registered strictly under my sole name, and locked behind layers of biometric and legal security that not even a federal judge could easily untangle. Then the real surgery began. With precise legal strokes, Kenneth drafted the transfer documents. We took every single physical asset belonging to Gallagher Logistics, the shipping fleets, the commercial real estate, the storage warehouses, the international ports, and transferred ownership directly into the new blind trust. We did not stop there. We ported over every lucrative client contract, every vendor agreement, and every liquid capital reserve. We transferred the massive payroll accounts, the corporate insurance policies, and the intellectual property. By the time the sun began to set over the city skyline, Gallagher Logistics, the massive corporate entity that Brian had fraudulently pledged as collateral, was completely drained of its lifeblood. The corporate name still existed on paper. The tax identification number was still active, but the entity itself was nothing more than a ghost. It was an empty shell devoid of a single dollar, a single truck, or a single client. Kenneth printed the final stack of documents and pushed them across the desk. I signed my name over and over again, feeling a surge of raw, undeniable power with every stroke of the pen. I was cutting the umbilical cord to my parasitic son. When the final document was notarized and digitally filed with the State Commerce Department, the trap was officially set. Kenneth poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon from a crystal decanter on his shelf. He handed me one, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. He explained exactly what was going to happen next. The predatory venture capitalists who loaned Brian the $3 million would eventually conduct a routine financial audit to check the health of their collateral. They would look into the accounts of Gallagher Logistics, and they would find absolutely nothing. 0 assets, 0 revenue, 0 value. When they realized they had loaned $3 million against an empty, worthless shell, they would immediately trigger a catastrophic default clause. They would not come after me because my name was thoroughly insulated and the fraudulent signatures of my son clearly absolved me of involvement. Instead, those ruthless investors would turn all of their violent, litigious fury directly onto Brian and Amanda. They would bypass the corporate veil and attack my son personally. They would freeze his bank accounts, seize his remaining tech assets, and demand their $3 million back with crippling interest. Brian would be left standing in the wreckage of his own arrogant deceit, holding a massive unpayable debt, while the people he stole from prepared to destroy his life. I raised my glass, touched it gently against the glass of my attorney, and took a slow, burning sip of the bourbon. My family wanted to play a game of shadows and theft. They were about to learn that they had brought a knife to a nuclear war. The doorbell chimed through the quiet expanse of my home just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I walked slowly toward the foyer, dragging my feet slightly to practice the sluggish gait of a failing man. When I opened the heavy wooden door, my son Brian and his wife Amanda stood on the porch. They held overpriced canvas grocery bags, overflowing with fresh produce and expensive cuts of meat. Brian wore a designer cashmere sweater, a garment I knew was paid for by the very logistics empire he was currently trying to steal from me. Amanda wore her signature rehearsed smile, her perfectly manicured hands gripping a bottle of red wine. They announced they had come to cook a warm family dinner for me, claiming they simply could not bear the thought of their poor father eating alone while Cynthia was away on her wellness retreat in Hawaii. If I had not seen the encrypted ledgers and the horrifying emails, my heart would have swelled with paternal pride. Instead, my stomach turned. I stepped aside, hunching my shoulders, and welcomed my executioners into my home. Amanda immediately took over the kitchen, unpacking the groceries with loud performative enthusiasm. The smell of searing garlic and roasting herbs soon filled the house, creating a suffocating illusion of domestic warmth. I sat at the marble kitchen island, resting my head heavily on my hand, putting on a masterclass in physical decay. Brian sat on the stool beside me, pouring me a glass of water with a look of intense predatory observation. He asked me how I was feeling, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern. He casually inquired if I had been forgetting things lately, suggesting that Mom had mentioned my memory was slipping before she left for her trip. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was laying the psychological groundwork, planting the seeds of doubt in my own mind. I played right into his hands. I let my sentences trail off. I stared blankly at the granite countertop for uncomfortably long moments. I rubbed my temples and muttered that the days were blurring together, and that my mind felt like it was wrapped in a thick fog. Brian nodded slowly, a dark, victorious gleam shining in his eyes. He reached out and patted my shoulder, telling me not to worry, promising that he and Amanda were there to handle all the heavy burdens for me. We moved to the dining room to eat the meal Amanda had prepared. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, but I chewed slowly, pretending to struggle with my appetite. Throughout the dinner, they maintained a barrage of gentle, probing questions. They asked if I remembered where I placed the spare keys to the warehouse or if I recalled the passcode to the home security system. Every question was a calculated test to measure my supposed cognitive decline. I gave them hesitant, incorrect answers. I watched Brian exchange a quick, triumphant look with his wife across the table. They believed the heavy metal toxins Cynthia had been feeding me were fully taking hold. They believed my brain was rotting away, leaving behind a compliant, empty vessel. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my hands from trembling with absolute rage. I wanted to reach across the table and shake him. I wanted to ask him how he could look his father in the eyes while actively participating in my murder. But I swallowed my anger, taking a weak sip of water, allowing them to bask in their fabricated superiority. After the plates were cleared, Brian walked into the living room and retrieved a sleek leather briefcase he had left by the door. He returned to the dining table, his face adopting a mask of reluctant responsibility. He sighed heavily, pulling a thick stack of stapled papers from the leather bag. He slid the documents across the polished wood toward me, tapping the top page casually. He told me it was just some routine tax paperwork for the end of the quarter. He claimed my accountant had sent them over to his office by mistake, and that they simply needed my signature to keep the logistics company compliant with federal regulations. He even offered a self-deprecating laugh, complaining about how tedious corporate bureaucracy had become. I pulled the documents closer, squinting hard, as if my vision was failing. I did not need to read the fine print to know what they were. I had drafted thousands of corporate contracts in my lifetime. The bold text at the top of the second page was unmistakably clear. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. The subsequent pages contained a complete transfer of my corporate voting rights, effectively surrendering total control of Gallagher Logistics directly into the hands of Brian. But the most sickening document was attached at the very back. It was a certified medical evaluation signed by a corrupt private physician I had never even met. The fraudulent document stated unequivocally that George Gallagher was suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia and was entirely incapable of managing his own personal and financial affairs. Brian was trying to legally erase my existence. He was trying to strip away my autonomy, my wealth, and my voice, leaving me as a ward of the state under his absolute control. Brian leaned in close, tapping the signature line at the bottom of the first page with a heavy gold pen he had pulled from his pocket. He urged me to just sign quickly so we could move to the living room and watch a baseball game. He promised he would handle all the boring details. I slowly pushed his gold pen away, shaking my head with a weak, confused smile. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a sleek, unassuming black fountain pen. I mumbled that I always preferred to sign important documents with my own lucky pen, the one I had used since I started the company. Brian let out a short, patronizing laugh, telling me that was perfectly fine, indulging what he thought that was the harmless eccentricity of a senile old man. He had absolutely no idea that the pen I held in my hand was a highly specialized piece of corporate espionage equipment provided directly by my attorney Kenneth. The black fountain pen looked entirely ordinary, but the ink cartridge inside was a marvel of chemical engineering. It was filled with a proprietary friction-based auto-evaporating compound used exclusively for classified temporary document drafting. When the ink flowed onto the paper, it appeared as a bold, permanent dark blue. It looked completely authentic, indistinguishable from standard ballpoint ink. However, the chemical structure of the compound was designed to react with the oxygen in the air. Over a precise window of 48 hours, the ink would begin to destabilize and fade. By the time the weekend was over, every single stroke of the pen would evaporate entirely, leaving absolutely no trace of residue indentations or pigment on the page. The paper would be left perfectly, flawlessly blank. I uncapped the pen, my hand hovering over the fraudulent power of attorney. I put on one final pathetic display. I looked up at Brian with wide, uncertain eyes, asking him again if he was sure this was just for the taxes. I asked if his mother needed to sign anything. Brian smiled a cold, shark-like grin and assured me that everything was perfectly fine and that he was taking care of me. I lowered the pen to the paper. I slowly, deliberately signed my full name on the bottom of the first page. The dark blue ink soaked into the fiber of the document, sealing their fake victory. Brian quickly flipped the page, pointing to the next signature line. I signed the transfer of corporate voting rights. I signed the medical acknowledgement form. I signed every single piece of paper he pushed in front of me, putting my name on the line 14 times. With every signature, my internal satisfaction grew. I was handing them a loaded gun filled with blank ammunition. When the final page was signed, Brian snatched the stack of documents off the table with a speed that betrayed his desperate greed. He carefully arranged them, slipping them securely back into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. The tension in the room instantly vanished. Amanda walked back into the dining room, her face glowing with victory, and offered to clean up the kitchen. I told them not to worry, claiming I was incredibly exhausted and just wanted to go to sleep. Brian and Amanda practically beamed with joy. They had what they came for. They wished me a wonderful night, promised to check on me tomorrow, and hurried toward the front door. I stood in the doorway, hunching my shoulders, leaning heavily against the doorframe, as I watched them walk down the driveway to their luxury sports car. Brian opened the trunk and gently placed his briefcase inside, as if it contained the crown jewels. They drove away into the night, undoubtedly planning how to spend the millions of dollars they thought they had just legally acquired. I closed the heavy front door and locked it. The moment the deadbolt clicked, my posture completely transformed. I stood up perfectly straight. I rolled my shoulders back, taking a deep, powerful breath of the quiet air. I walked back to the dining table, picked up my specialized black pen, and placed it securely back into my pocket. In exactly 48 hours, when Brian walked into a bank or a courtroom to execute his hostile takeover, he would proudly open his briefcase, pull out that thick stack of legal documents, and find nothing but blank, empty white paper. His legal coup was dead before it even began, and the countdown to his absolute ruin had officially started. I sat in the dim light of my home office waiting for the digital chime of an incoming video call. I had spent the last hour meticulously preparing my environment and my appearance for this exact moment. I closed the heavy velvet curtains to block out the morning sun, casting the room in a dull, sickly gray shadow. I unbuttoned the collar of my shirt and ruffled my hair to make it look unkempt and neglected. Using a damp cloth, I dabbed a thin layer of moisture onto my forehead to simulate a cold sweat. I needed to look like a man whose body was quietly giving up. On my desk, perfectly angled just out of frame of my phone camera, was my encrypted corporate laptop. I had activated a highly specialized screen recording software designed to capture both high-definition video and isolated audio channels. Every single word my wife was about to say would be permanently digitally archived. Right on schedule, my cell phone vibrated across the mahogany desk. The screen illuminated with an incoming video request from Cynthia. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward and softening my facial muscles to project absolute exhaustion. I tapped the green button to accept the call. The screen flickered to life, and there she was. The contrast between my dark, carefully staged office and her background was violently jarring. Cynthia was sitting on a sun-drenched luxury balcony in Maui. Behind her, the pristine blue waters of the Pacific Ocean stretched out to the horizon. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and oversized designer sunglasses, sipping something bright pink from a tall glass. She looked absolutely radiant, the picture of a wealthy, carefree socialite enjoying a spiritual wellness retreat. It took every ounce of my self-control not to crush the phone in my bare hands. She pulled her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose and let out a loud, exaggerated gasp. She told me that I looked absolutely terrible, her voice dripping with a thick, sickeningly sweet syrup that made my stomach turn. I forced a weak, shaky smile to my lips. I told her I was just feeling a little under the weather and that the house felt so big and empty without her. I leaned closer to the camera, letting my breathing sound shallow and labored. I told her I had been spending most of the day resting in bed because my energy levels were completely depleted. Cynthia leaned closer to her screen, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied my face. The fake sympathy washed over her features like a cheap mask. She called me her poor, sweet husband and reminded me that she always told me I was working too hard. Then she steered the conversation exactly where I needed it to go. She asked me if I had been taking my special supplements every single morning, just like she showed me. There it was, the hook I needed. I nodded slowly, running a trembling hand through my messy hair. I told her I had been taking the 2 large capsules from the amber bottle exactly as she instructed me to do. I made sure to speak clearly, enunciating my words for the hidden recording software. I asked her if she was absolutely certain those imported supplements were safe, because my stomach had been in knots ever since she left. Cynthia let out a soft, dismissive laugh, waving her manicured hand in the air. She told me not to be silly and scolded me playfully. She stated clearly that she had spent months researching those specific joint supplements just for me. She went on to say that she personally ordered them from an exclusive holistic clinic overseas and portioned them out for me herself. She assured me they were completely safe and natural. She told me I just had to trust her and keep taking them every single day without fail. She demanded that I promise her I would not skip a single dose. I looked directly into the camera and promised her I would take every last pill she had left for me. I had just recorded my wife explicitly admitting that she alone sourced, purchased, and managed the exact capsules that I now knew contained a lethal heavy metal neurotoxin. It was a digital confession wrapped in the guise of matrimonial care. To sell the performance completely, I suddenly doubled over, clutching my chest, and descending into a violently forced coughing fit. I hacked and wheezed into my fist, making sure the microphone picked up the wet, rattling sound in my lungs. When I finally sat back up, I squeezed my eyes shut and groaned, complaining that my chest felt incredibly tight, and that a strange, heavy pressure was radiating down my left arm. Through the screen, I watched the micro-expressions dance across the face of my wife. She tried to maintain her look of worried devotion, but she could not completely hide the dark, predatory gleam of triumph that flashed in her eyes. She believed the poison had reached its critical mass. She believed the tight chest and the shooting pain in my arm were the undeniable warning signs of an imminent massive myocardial infarction. She believed she was watching a dead man taking his final breaths. She quickly composed herself, taking another delicate sip of her pink drink. She told me I was making her so worried, her tone shifting to a breezy, casual cadence. She said she felt terrible even bringing it up, but her wellness guru in Maui had strongly suggested she extend her spiritual cleansing program. She was originally supposed to fly back on Friday, but she informed me she was going to stay an extra 3 days. She claimed she really needed to finish her meditation cycle. She asked me if I would be okay on my own until Monday. The cold, calculated brilliance of her plan was staggering. She was extending her trip to guarantee her alibi was ironclad. She had monitored my fabricated symptoms and calculated that my heart would give out sometime over the weekend. By extending her stay, she ensured she would be thousands of miles away, surrounded by resort staff and hotel cameras, when the police inevitably called to inform her that her husband had died suddenly in his sleep. She was building a fortress of deniability while staring me right in the face. I nodded weakly, offering her a pathetic, grateful smile. I told her she absolutely needed to stay and enjoy her retreat. I insisted that my health was just a minor inconvenience and that I would manage perfectly fine here alone. I told her I loved her and that I could not wait for her to come back home. Cynthia beamed, a genuine smile of absolute victory spreading across her face. She told me I was the best husband a woman could ever ask for and blew a kiss to the camera. She told me to get some rest and promised to call me tomorrow. The screen went black. The call disconnected. The silence of my dark office rushed back in. I sat perfectly still for a long moment, letting the absolute finality of her betrayal wash over me. I reached over to my encrypted laptop and stopped the screen recording. I watched the progress bar as the high-definition video and audio files were compressed and saved directly into my secure, isolated hard drive. I replayed the final 10 seconds of the call, listening to her sweet, poisonous voice promising to call me tomorrow. I had secured the holy grail of evidence. It was no longer just a theory based on ledgers and private investigator notes. I had a crystal-clear, high-definition video of my wife confessing to controlling the exact substance that was meant to kill me. She had happily provided her motive, her method, and her timeline in one single flawless conversation. I meticulously created 3 digital backups of the video file, routing them to heavily encrypted cloud servers scattered across different global jurisdictions, just as I would with my most sensitive corporate trade secrets. If anything happened to my local machine, the evidence against Cynthia would survive and automatically deploy to my attorney. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the heavy velvet curtains. I pulled them open, letting the bright afternoon sun flood into the room, wiping away the fabricated gray shadows of my sickbed. I wiped the damp cloth across my forehead, removing the fake sweat. I unbuttoned my collar, took a deep breath of the clean air, and stood tall. Cynthia believed she had just cemented her perfect alibi. She believed she was 3 days away from inheriting a massive logistics empire and an endless supply of wealth. She had absolutely no idea that her extended vacation had just given me the exact window of time I needed to systematically obliterate her entire world. The countdown had not started for my failing heart. The countdown had started for her absolute ruin. The venture capital firm backing the tech startup of my son was not run by forgiving people. They were apex predators in the financial district, men and women who smiled warmly while holding a knife to your ribs. When they handed Brian $3 million, they did so entirely because they believed my life work was the underlying collateral. Every quarter, their automated systems and junior analysts conducted routine health checks on the corporate entities guaranteeing their massive loans. It was supposed to be a simple digital handshake, an algorithm pinging the accounts of Gallagher Logistics to verify liquidity and physical assets. But on this particular Thursday morning, that digital handshake grasped nothing but thin air. The analysts dug deeper, assuming a routing error. They checked the property registries, the commercial fleet licenses, and the payroll escrow accounts. They found a wasteland. The corporate tax identification number was active, but the entity itself held zero capital. The shipping contracts were gone. The warehouses were gone. The fleet of trucks was gone. Gallagher Logistics was an empty cardboard box sitting in a rainstorm. Venture capitalists do not make polite phone calls when $3 million vanish from their ledgers. They execute aggressive legal protocols coded deep into their lending contracts. The moment the audit confirmed the collateral was a ghost, a catastrophic default clause was instantly triggered. This specific clause was ruthless. It bypassed the protective corporate veil entirely because the original loan was secured with fraudulent representations. The lenders did not care about the complexities of family betrayal or forged documents. They only cared about recovering their capital. An automated legal directive was fired directly to the federal banking networks. It ordered an immediate and uncompromising freeze on any and all assets connected to the guarantor. Since Brian had eagerly signed his own name to the fraudulent leverage documents, the banking networks targeted him with absolute precision. Brian and Amanda were sitting in the dining room of their exclusive country club when the financial guillotine dropped. I could picture the scene perfectly. They were probably sipping imported mineral water and picking at expensive salads, laughing about the vast empire they were about to inherit. When the waiter brought the bill, Amanda likely handed over her heavy platinum credit card without a second thought. The waiter returned a few minutes later, his face flushed with polite embarrassment, explaining that the card had been declined. Brian, annoyed by the minor inconvenience, would have pulled out his own premium corporate card. Declined. A secondary debit card. Declined. Every piece of plastic in their designer wallets was instantly transformed into useless garbage. Brian would have stormed out to the country club parking lot, dialing his private wealth manager in a fit of arrogant rage. The wealth manager would not have apologized. He would have delivered the cold and clinical truth. Every single checking account, savings portfolio, and emergency fund under their names had been locked by an emergency injunction from the venture capital firm. Their digital access was revoked. Their liquid cash was seized. The luxury cars they drove to the club were now legally targeted for repossession. The $3 million phantom debt had crashed down directly onto their personal shoulders. In a matter of 60 seconds, my son and his wife went from wealthy socialites to penniless debtors standing in a parking lot. My cell phone began to ring as I sat quietly in my home office. The caller identification displayed the name of my son. The phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk, a desperate plea for salvation from a man who was drowning. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I cleared my throat, forcing the muscles in my neck to tighten, intentionally restricting my vocal cords. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally swiped the screen to answer. I did not say a standard greeting. I let out a weak and rattling breath that sounded like a man struggling simply to exist. Brian did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was a frantic and high-pitched shriek. He screamed into the receiver, asking me what was happening with the company. He yelled that his accounts were frozen and that his lenders were threatening to seize his house. He demanded to know where the assets of Gallagher Logistics had gone. He was hyperventilating, his words stumbling over each other in a chaotic rush of pure terror. I listened to his panic with a deep and silent satisfaction. Then I began the performance that would seal his doom. I slurred my words, heavily dragging out the syllables as if my tongue was swollen and numb. I told him I did not know what he was talking about. I whispered that my head hurt terribly and that the room was spinning. Brian screamed louder, begging me to focus. He asked me about the bank transfers and the corporate trust. I let out a confused and pathetic whimper. I told him that I could not remember how to log into the banking portal anymore. I said the numbers on the screen were floating around and making no sense. I murmured that Cynthia usually handled all the passwords, but she was in Hawaii, and I was so very tired. I told him my mind was slipping away, just like the doctor had warned us it would. I played the exact role of the dementia-ridden and failing old man that he had gleefully documented in his forged paperwork. I used his own fraudulent medical diagnosis as the weapon to destroy his last shred of hope. I heard Brian choke back a sob of absolute despair. He realized in that agonizing moment that the wealthy and powerful father he relied on to fix his mistakes was gone. He believed the heavy metal toxins had finally dissolved my cognitive functions. He believed he was screaming at a hollow shell of a human being. He begged me to try to remember the name of my corporate attorney. I responded with a long and vacant silence. I muttered something nonsensical about needing to check the furnace in the basement, and then I simply let the phone slip from my ear. I did not hang up. I just placed the device gently on the desk, leaving the line open. I sat in my quiet office, listening to the tiny voice of my son echoing from the speaker. He was crying now. Real and ugly tears of a man who knew his entire life was over. He was shouting into the void, begging for a miracle that was never going to come. I reached over and tapped the screen to end the call, cutting off his cries instantly. The silence returned to my office, thick and peaceful. The first domino had fallen flawlessly. Brian was financially decapitated, isolated, and waiting for the predatory lenders to strip the flesh from his bones. The trap was working perfectly, and I had not even broken a sweat. The digital tripwire I had meticulously embedded into the $80,000 wire transfer detonated with absolute precision less than 12 hours after Scott signed the document. I was monitoring the specific corporate escrow dashboard on my encrypted laptop, watching the digital footprint of my son-in-law as he blindly triggered his own financial execution. The moment the funds hit his local checking account in Chicago, Scott did exactly what I knew an arrogant, desperate gambling addict would do. He did not let the money settle. He did not contact an accountant. He immediately attempted to route the entire sum directly into a known offshore betting syndicate based in the Cayman Islands to satisfy the violent men holding his debt. The moment he initiated that offshore transfer, the specialized routing codes my attorney Kenneth had attached to the funds flared like a distress beacon across the federal banking network. The transaction was instantly flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The automated system recognized that Scott was attempting to move money legally, designated as a commercial tax liability loan, into an illegal international gambling ring. The response was not a polite phone call or a warning letter. It was an immediate, catastrophic, automated asset seizure. I watched the status bars on my screen turn a violent shade of red as the commercial banking protocols engaged. Because Scott had blindly signed the digital contract binding his personal assets as collateral to Gallagher Logistics, the bank executed a total clawback. Not only did they intercept and freeze the $80,000 he was attempting to wire offshore, but the system aggressively swept every other account tied to his Social Security number to satisfy the breach of contract. His savings account was zeroed. His remaining stock portfolios were liquidated at market value. The system placed an immediate, non-negotiable lien on his luxury home in Chicago. Scott had essentially handed the federal government the keys to his entire life, wrapped in a neat, legally binding bow. My phone rang violently later that evening. It was not Scott. It was my daughter, Rachel. Her voice was no longer the fragile weeping pitch of a scared little girl seeking comfort from her father. It was a shrill, hyperventilating screech of pure, unfiltered panic. She was screaming so loudly into the receiver that the audio distorted. She yelled that Scott had just been locked out of all their accounts and that the bank had called to inform them their home was currently under an active commercial lien. She demanded to know what was wrong with the wire transfer, screaming that my accountant must have made a horrible mistake and that I needed to fix it immediately before they were thrown out onto the street. I held the phone away from my ear, letting her hysteria wash over me. I allowed a long, dragging silence to stretch between us before I finally spoke. I let my voice quaver, infusing it with a heavy, confused exhaustion. I told her I did not understand what she was talking about. I murmured that I had authorized the transfer just like she asked, but that my head was spinning, and I was having trouble following her words. I told her the doctor said the new supplements were supposed to help, but I was feeling so incredibly weak and lost. I played the role of the dying, incompetent old man to absolute perfection, knowing every slurred word was twisting the knife deeper into her panic. Rachel screamed in frustration, telling me she did not have time for me to be confused. She shrieked that she was calling Brian to fix this mess, convinced that her brother was sitting on a mountain of our stolen family wealth. She slammed the phone down, disconnecting the call. I leaned back in my leather chair, a dark, satisfied smile crossing my face. I opened the encrypted audio files that Gavin had previously extracted from their devices, bringing up the active surveillance tap on their communication channels. I listened to the live audio feed as Rachel called her brother. The conversation did not start with greetings or familial comfort. It ignited into a vicious, screaming war the moment Brian answered. Rachel accused Brian of hoarding the family money and demanded he transfer her $100,000 immediately to save her home. Brian, currently suffocating under $3 million of fraudulent, unpayable venture capital debt, exploded. He screamed back at her, his voice cracking with sheer terror, calling her a spoiled, greedy parasite. He yelled that his own accounts were frozen, that his tech startup was dead, and that aggressive litigators were threatening to seize everything he owned because the assets of Gallagher Logistics had mysteriously vanished into thin air. The alliance between my children, built on the rotten foundation of my impending murder, completely fractured into millions of jagged pieces. They tore into each other with a savagery that was both horrifying and profoundly revealing. Rachel screamed that Brian was a failure who had always squandered my money. Brian roared back that Rachel was enabling a pathetic gambling addict and had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars behind their backs. They traded venomous insults exposing every secret resentment and deep-seated jealousy they had harbored against each other for decades. They blamed each other for the fact that my money was suddenly out of reach. Listening to them tear each other apart, I realized the absolute brilliance of my strategy. I did not need to confront them. I did not need to scream or threaten them. By simply removing their access to my wealth and accelerating the consequences of their own reckless greed, they were doing the work of destroying each other for me. They were trapped in a burning house of their own making, frantically searching for an exit, while the flames climbed higher. And the most beautiful, terrifying part of it all was that they were both desperately banking their survival on the return of their mother from Hawaii. They were both waiting for Cynthia to walk through the front door, believing she held the keys to my kingdom. They were praying for my heart to stop beating, completely unaware that I was sitting comfortably in my office holding the matches they used to start the fire. The afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the polished mahogany of the dining room table. I sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, a crystal glass of expensive aged bourbon resting in my hand. The house was immaculately clean and profoundly quiet. I had spent the morning preparing for the arrival of my loving wife. I wore a crisp white button-down shirt and a tailored navy blazer. My hair was neatly combed and I had made sure to shave, leaving my face looking sharp and entirely vibrant. The heavy metal toxins were completely flushed from my system. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. I felt more alive at 64 than I had in a decade. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, letting the pleasant burn settle in my chest, and I waited for the front door to open. According to her flight schedule, Cynthia was due to arrive at exactly 4 in the afternoon. I knew she would not call ahead from the airport. She would want her arrival to be a surprise. Or rather, she would want to walk into the house expecting a horrific discovery. I could perfectly imagine the performance she had rehearsed on her long flight from Maui. She would unlock the door, call out my name with fabricated sweetness, and then scream when she found my lifeless body in the bedroom. She probably had her phone gripped tightly in her manicured hand, ready to dial emergency services and put on the Weeping Widow act for the paramedics. At 4:15, the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the silence. A heavy car door slammed shut. The rolling wheels of designer luggage clattered up the front walkway. I remained perfectly still, swirling the bourbon in my glass. The heavy brass lock on the front door clicked loudly. The hinges creaked just a fraction. Cynthia stepped into the foyer. I heard her set her heavy suitcase down on the marble tiles. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, meant for an empty house. "George, honey, I am home," she called out. Her voice was laced with a sickly, trembling hesitation. It was the voice of a woman bracing herself to find a corpse. She did not walk toward the kitchen. I heard her footsteps moving slowly, deliberately toward the first-floor master suite. She was hunting for my body. "I am right in here, my love," I called out from the dining room. My voice was booming, rich, and completely steady. It echoed through the open floor plan, bouncing off the high ceilings. The footsteps in the hallway stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I could almost hear the gears grinding to a violent halt inside her treacherous mind. Slowly, very slowly, Cynthia backed out of the hallway and turned the corner into the dining room. When her eyes met mine, the physical reaction was spectacular. Cynthia froze completely. The expensive designer sunglasses perched on her head nearly slipped off. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her deeply tanned skin looking sickly and gray. Her jaw went slack. Her eyes widened in absolute unfiltered horror. She looked at my crisp clothes, my upright posture, and the glass of bourbon resting easily in my hand. She was staring at a ghost who refused to die. "George," she stammered, her voice cracking into a high, breathless squeak. "You are up. You are out of bed." I smiled warmly, projecting the image of a completely oblivious, happy husband. I stood up from my chair with effortless grace, walking over to her and wrapping my arms around her rigid, trembling body. She felt as stiff as a wooden board. I kissed her cheek, inhaling the scent of tropical flowers and stale airplane air. I stepped back and beamed at her. I told her I was feeling absolutely incredible. I said the last few days had been a total revelation. I explained that the horrible chest pains and the terrible brain fog had completely vanished. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her that her special imported supplements had worked an absolute miracle. Cynthia swallowed hard, her throat bobbing nervously. She forced the corners of her mouth up into a grotesque, trembling smile. "That is wonderful news, honey," she whispered, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an explanation. "I thought you were feeling worse. On our video call you looked so incredibly tired." I laughed a rich, hearty laugh. I told her the fatigue must have just been my body fighting off a minor bug, but that I had bounced back stronger than ever. I patted my chest, declaring that my heart felt like it could beat for another 50 years. With every single word of good news, I watched Cynthia internally suffocate. Her perfect lethal timeline was in ruins. Her alibi in Hawaii had been entirely wasted. She was standing in the same room with the man she had meticulously plotted to murder, and he was offering her a drink. I walked back to the dining table and picked up my glass. I told her that I was so thrilled by my sudden recovery that I had decided we needed to celebrate. I informed her that I had called Brian, Amanda, Rachel, and Scott, and invited them all over for a very important family dinner tonight. I told her I had ordered catering from her favorite Italian restaurant downtown. I said that surviving this recent health scare made me realize how precious life was, and that I wanted to gather the entire family tonight to formally discuss the future of the estate and my corporate succession plans. Cynthia gripped the back of a dining chair to steady herself. Her knuckles turned bone white. The mention of the family dinner and the estate planning sent a visible shockwave through her body. She knew Brian and Rachel were currently tearing each other apart over the frozen accounts. She knew her children were drowning in debt and desperate for the inheritance she had promised them. Now she was going to have to face all of them in the same room with her very much alive husband sitting at the head of the table. "That sounds like a big evening, George," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to go upstairs and unpack. I need to wash up after the long flight." I smiled affectionately and told her to take all the time she needed. I watched her turn around and practically run out of the dining room. She did not head up the stairs to the master suite. My ears tracked her hurried footsteps as she moved down the hallway, taking a sharp left turn toward the basement door. I remained at the dining table, taking another slow sip of bourbon, savoring the profound, beautiful irony of the moment. I had placed a small, discreet motion sensor camera in the corner of the basement stairs. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the live feed. I watched Cynthia sprinting down the wooden steps, her expensive wedge heels clacking loudly against the concrete floor. She rushed past the furnace and shoved the heavy winter storage shelves aside with frantic, desperate strength. She stood in front of the concealed, reinforced steel door, breathing heavily, her hands reaching out to inspect the hardware. She grabbed the 4 heavy-duty padlocks I had purchased from the hardware store. She yanked on them, twisting the metal shanks, checking the structural integrity of the steel hasps. They were securely locked. They were identical to the ones she had placed there 3 weeks ago. She pressed her ear against the cold steel door, listening intently. Of course, she heard absolutely nothing from the soundproofed subcellar. Gavin was safely recovering in an undisclosed hotel room guarded by my private security team. The room behind that door was completely empty, but Cynthia did not know that. Through the grainy black and white footage on my phone, I watched her shoulders sag with a massive sigh of relief. She closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the steel door. In her twisted sociopathic mind, the situation was salvageable. Her husband had somehow survived the poison, and her children were likely panicked, but her darkest, most damning secret was still safely locked away in the dark. She believed the private investigator was still tied to that chair, effectively neutralizing the only man who could expose her embezzlement ring. She believed she still held the winning hand. She carefully moved the storage shelves back into place meticulously, aligning the plastic bins to cover the seams of the hidden door. She smoothed out her expensive clothes, took a deep, steadying breath, and marched back up the basement stairs. She was preparing herself to put on the performance of a lifetime at the family dinner tonight. She thought she could placate her angry children, lie to my face, and simply resume poisoning my morning water the very next day. I turned off the video feed and slipped my phone back into my pocket. The absolute arrogance of her relief was the final nail in her coffin. Cynthia thought she had secured her safety by checking those padlocks. She had no idea that she had just locked herself inside a burning building. I finished the last drop of my bourbon, set the crystal glass on the table, and waited for my beautiful, treacherous family to arrive for their final meal. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 in the evening. I sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, watching the foyer through the open archway. Cynthia hurried to open the door, playing the role of the delighted matriarch. But the children who walked through that door did not look like wealthy heirs preparing to celebrate. They looked like prisoners walking to the gallows. Brian and Amanda entered first. My son had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. His designer suit looked rumpled, as if he had been sweating in it all day. Amanda was gripping her expensive purse so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. Rachel and Scott followed close behind them. Scott looked physically ill. His skin was pale and covered in a thin sheen of nervous sweat. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected a collection agent to step out of the bushes and drag him away. The tension in the air was absolute and suffocating. It hung over the room like a heavy, wet blanket. As they gathered around the dining table, no one spoke. The usual fake pleasantries were entirely absent. They all stared at me sitting upright and looking healthier than I had in years. I smiled warmly at them, gesturing for everyone to take a seat. I told them how wonderful it was to have the whole family together under one roof. Brian swallowed hard, unable to look me directly in the eyes. Rachel kept her gaze fixed firmly on her empty plate. The catered Italian food arrived exactly on time. I served myself a generous portion of roasted meats and rich pasta. I ate with genuine appetite, savoring every single bite. The rest of my family barely touched their food. The only sounds in the dining room were the scraping of my fork against the porcelain plate and the relentless, muffled vibrating of their cell phones. It started with Scott. His phone buzzed aggressively in his jacket pocket. He flinched every time it happened. Then, the phone of Brian began to vibrate against the table. Then Amanda. Then Rachel. Their devices were exploding with automated alerts from banks, from venture capital debt collectors, and from federal fraud departments. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, terrified to answer the calls and even more terrified to ignore them. Cynthia sat at the opposite end of the table, oblivious to the financial slaughter happening right in front of her. She believed the awkward silence was simply grief and confusion over my sudden recovery. She poured herself a large glass of red wine and tapped her manicured fingernail against the crystal rim. She put on a brave, tragic smile and looked at the children. She cleared her throat and announced that we needed to have a very serious family discussion. She looked at me with eyes full of fake sorrow and told the table that my recent health scare had been a massive wake-up call for everyone. She spun a beautiful, sickening narrative about how much I had sacrificed for the company and how unfair it was for me to carry the heavy burdens of the estate in my declining years. Cynthia took a deep breath, folding her hands gracefully on the table. She declared that starting tomorrow morning, she and the children would be officially activating the comprehensive power of attorney. She claimed this was the only way to relieve my stress and ensure the family legacy was protected. She spoke with the absolute confidence of a woman who believed she held all the winning cards. She looked toward Brian, fully expecting her golden boy to back up her hostile takeover. But Brian did not say a word. He looked like he was about to vomit. He stared at his mother with wide, terrified eyes, knowing that any legal authority he thought he possessed was utterly useless against the massive debt currently crushing his throat. I let her words hang in the silent room. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice. I took my time. I picked up a linen napkin from my lap and slowly, deliberately wiped the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate and folded my hands, resting them on the polished wood. I looked at Cynthia and offered her a soft, terrifyingly calm smile. I told her that her concern for my well-being was truly touching. I said it was incredibly fortunate that Brian had brought those tax documents over the other night, because it saved us all a tremendous amount of time. I reached down to the heavy leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. The metallic snap of the brass latches echoed loudly in the deadly quiet room. I pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. It was the exact same packet of documents Brian had manipulated me into signing. The irrevocable power of attorney, the transfer of corporate voting rights, the fraudulent medical evaluation. I held the stack of papers in my hand, feeling the heavy weight of their treachery. I looked directly at Brian. His eyes locked onto the documents, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. I tossed the thick stack of papers down the center of the long dining table. They slid across the polished mahogany and stopped right in front of my son. I told Brian to open them. I told him to look at the signatures he was planning to use to steal my life. Brian reached out with trembling fingers. He slowly flipped open the cover page. His eyes scanned the bottom of the document where my signature was supposed to be. He froze. He flipped to the next page and then the next, pulling the papers apart in a frantic, desperate search. The pages were completely blank. The dark blue ink had completely evaporated, leaving absolutely no trace behind. The legal authority they had celebrated was nothing more than an illusion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I explained to my terrified family the basic chemistry of friction-based auto-evaporating ink. I told them that the weapon they thought they held was legally void and physically empty. I watched the realization crash over Cynthia. Her face turned a sickly shade of white as she stared at the blank papers scattered across the table, but I was not finished. I turned my attention back to Brian. I told him I knew exactly why his phone had not stopped vibrating since he walked into my house. I told him I knew all about the $3 million in high-interest venture capital he had secured using my company as collateral. Brian gasped, gripping the edge of the table, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and delivered the final devastating blow. I informed my son that the corporate empire he had fraudulently leveraged no longer existed. I explained that my attorney and I had executed a total financial decapitation. We had transferred every single physical asset, every shipping contract, every warehouse, and every dollar of liquid capital into an irrevocable blind trust under my sole name. I told him that the logistics company he had proudly offered to his ruthless investors was now a completely hollow shell. It was a ghost town. I watched the remaining color drain from his face as he realized the absolute finality of his situation. I told him that his massive loans were backed by absolutely nothing, and that the private lenders were currently targeting his personal assets to recover their stolen money. I glanced at Scott and Rachel, watching them realize that their own offshore banking fraud was equally exposed and utterly doomed. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The clinking of silverware had completely stopped. The fake smiles were gone. I sat at the head of the table looking at the broken, terrified faces of the people who had plotted to murder me for a payout. They had walked into my home expecting a simple dinner and a smooth transition of power. Instead, they found themselves locked inside a burning building with no exits. I took a slow, triumphant sip of my bourbon, reveling in the glorious, quiet destruction of my own parasitic family. I reached back into the dark interior of my heavy leather briefcase. The metallic snap of the latches had sounded like a firing squad just moments ago, but the execution was far from over. My family sat paralyzed around the mahogany dining table. The blank pages of their failed legal coup were still scattered among the untouched plates of expensive roasted meats and rich pasta. They thought the worst was over. They thought discovering the evaporating ink and the empty corporate shell was the final blow. They were catastrophically wrong. I was not just going to stop them from stealing my empire. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own greed. I pulled a thick manila envelope from the briefcase. I opened the flap and withdrew a certified legal document bearing the heavy red seal of a prominent Silicon Valley venture capital firm. I did not toss this document. I held it in my hand, looking directly at my son. Brian was sweating profusely, his expensive cashmere sweater clinging to his chest as he struggled to draw a full breath. I slowly slid the paper across the polished wood until it came to a rest, perfectly centered, in front of his empty dinner plate. I told Brian to read the bold print at the very top of the page. It was a formal notice of catastrophic default. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the silent room. I explained that when the private lenders audited Gallagher Logistics this morning, they found 0 assets. Because Brian had knowingly used an empty corporate shell to secure $3 million in predatory funding, the lenders had triggered a penalty clause for fraudulent representation. I watched the eyes of my son scan the legal text. I told him that the corporate veil no longer protected him. He was now held personally liable for the entire $3 million debt, plus exorbitant default penalties. I detailed exactly what that meant. I told him the lenders were already freezing his personal checking accounts, liquidating his tech startup, and placing a massive lien on his luxury home. I told him they were going to take the designer cars out of his driveway and the expensive clothes out of his closet. Brian let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling violently as the reality of a lifetime of inescapable debt crushed the air out of his lungs. Amanda, sitting right beside him, physically recoiled. She pushed her chair away from her husband, looking at him not with love or support, but with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She was already calculating how fast she could file for divorce to save her own skin. I did not give them a moment to breathe. I turned my cold gaze toward the other side of the table. Scott was sitting perfectly still, his face the color of wet ash. I reached into the envelope and withdrew a single stark white piece of paper. It featured the unmistakable crest of the federal government. I slid the document across the table toward my son-in-law. I told Scott that the $80,000 I wired him this morning was not a simple gift from a dying, confused old man. I explained that the money was routed through a highly monitored corporate escrow account explicitly coded as a callable commercial loan meant exclusively for federal tax liabilities. Rachel let out a sharp, confused whimper, but I kept my eyes locked entirely on Scott. I told him that I had watched his digital footprint as he blindly accepted the funds and immediately attempted to wire the entire sum to an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate in the Cayman Islands. Scott closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his pale cheek. I informed him that the federal banking network had instantly flagged the transaction as massive multi-tiered wire fraud. The document sitting in front of him was a federal asset seizure notice. I told him the government had already locked his remaining portfolios, seized his luxury home in Chicago, and initiated a criminal investigation that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Rachel began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she realized her husband was not just bankrupt, but bound for federal prison. The dining room was thick with the sour metallic stench of sheer terror. But the architect of this entire nightmare had not yet received her judgment. I turned my attention to the opposite end of the long table. Cynthia sat rigidly in her high-backed chair. Her jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching beneath her deeply tanned skin. She believed she was insulated. She believed that because she had kept her hands clean of the financial fraud, she could simply walk away and play the victim of her greedy children. I reached into the envelope one last time. I pulled out a stapled packet of medical and laboratory reports. I pushed the packet down the length of the table until it stopped right in front of her manicured hands. I spoke her name, my voice completely devoid of any affection or warmth. I told my wife that I knew all about the special imported supplements she had forced me to take every single morning. I watched her perfectly constructed facade begin to crack. I detailed the exact chemical composition of the slow-acting heavy metal neurotoxin she had sourced from a foreign clinic. I told her I knew the poison was designed to mimic the natural symptoms of rapid aging, leading to an inevitable and fatal cardiac event. Cynthia tried to speak, but her throat was completely dry. She opened and closed her mouth like a suffocating fish. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and systematically destroyed her perfect Hawaiian alibi. I told her I knew she had extended her luxury wellness retreat to ensure she was thousands of miles away, when my heart finally stopped beating. I told her I knew she planned to sip expensive cocktails on a sunny balcony while the paramedics carried my lifeless body out of this very house in a black bag. I watched the last shred of arrogant defiance drain from her eyes as I revealed my final secret. I told her that I had emptied every single toxic capsule weeks ago, replacing her lethal heavy metal with ordinary baking soda. I told her she had failed. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It lasted for exactly 10 seconds before the entire room exploded. The illusion of the wealthy, polite, perfect family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brian jumped to his feet, his chair crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at his mother. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. He shrieked that she had promised them a flawless execution. He yelled that she had guaranteed my death would be clean and that they would all be filthy rich by the end of the week. Rachel joined the chaotic frenzy, her voice a hysterical, ear-piercing screech. She slammed her hands on the mahogany table, accusing her mother of being a sloppy, incompetent fool. She wailed that Cynthia had led them blindly into a slaughterhouse, ruining all of their lives for absolutely nothing. Amanda began screaming at Brian, hurling vicious insults, demanding to know how he could be so stupid as to sign a multi-million-dollar collateral loan without verifying the assets. Scott buried his face in his hands, openly sobbing, completely paralyzed by the realization that his freedom was gone. Cynthia did not sit quietly and accept their blame. Like a cornered feral animal, she viciously turned on her own children. She stood up, knocking her glass of red wine onto the table, the dark liquid spilling across the white linen tablecloth like fresh blood. She screamed back at them, her voice raw and venomous. She called them useless, ungrateful parasites. She shrieked that she had done all the dangerous, dirty work of poisoning me every single morning, while they sat back like cowards, eagerly waiting for a free handout. The elegant dining room devolved into a savage, deafening war zone. They were no longer a family. They were a pack of starving wolves turning on each other in a desperate, ugly bid for self-preservation. They hurled blame, exposed deep-seated resentments, and threatened to testify against one another in court. They tore each other to pieces, completely forgetting that the man they had conspired to murder was still shouting quietly at the head of the table. I remained perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of my bloodline unfold, savoring the glorious, chaotic symphony of their ruin. Cynthia stood amidst the wreckage of her fractured family. The screaming of her children bounced off the dining room walls, but she was no longer looking at them. She slowly turned her head and locked her eyes entirely on me. The panicked, hyperventilating woman who had just realized her financial plans were ruined vanished in an instant. The loving, devoted wife I had known for 30 years evaporated into thin air, leaving behind something incredibly cold and dangerous. Her posture shifted dramatically. She stood up straight, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She sneered, her upper lip curling into an ugly expression of absolute contempt. She told her children to shut their pathetic mouths. The room went dead silent at the sudden sharp crack of her voice. She placed her palms flat against the mahogany table and leaned toward me. She dropped the high, sweet pitch she had used for decades, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly snarl. She told me that I was an absolute fool if I thought I had won this game. She spat that she had spent 30 years putting up with my boring, monotonous life, smiling at my tedious corporate stories and playing the perfect suburban hostess while I ignored her true value. She declared that she was legally entitled to half of every single asset I owned, regardless of my clever little corporate shell games. She threatened to hire the most ruthless, bloodthirsty divorce attorneys in the country. She promised to drag me into a brutal, endless legal war, filing injunction after injunction, tying up my remaining wealth in probate and family court for the rest of my natural life. She smiled a cruel, shark-like smile and swore she would bleed me completely dry in legal fees, ensuring I spent my final lonely years sitting in a freezing courtroom while she lived in absolute luxury on court-ordered alimony. I sat perfectly still, letting her toxic promises wash over the dining table. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let her savor the illusion of her legal leverage for a few precious seconds. I told her that her strategy was incredibly sound. I agreed that a drawn-out, vicious divorce would certainly decimate my peace of mind and severely drain my financial reserves. I admitted that the family court system inherently favored equitable distribution, and she might very well be entitled to half of my remaining empire under normal standard circumstances. Cynthia smirked, a triumphant, arrogant gleam returning to her dark eyes. She believed she had successfully backed me into a corner using the threat of mutual financial destruction as her ultimate shield. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored navy blazer. I did not pull out another legal document or a bank statement. My fingers wrapped around a sleek, black remote control. I pulled it out and rested it gently in the palm of my hand. I told my wife that a divorce court would only award her half of my assets if she were actually available to spend the money. I told her that she was severely underestimating the amount of leverage I was currently holding. I raised my hand and pointed the remote directly toward the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the wall in the adjacent darkened living room. I pressed a single tactile button. The large television flared to life, illuminating the dark living room with a harsh, bright glow. The screen did not show a news broadcast or a movie. It displayed a high-definition, crystal-clear security feed. The timestamp in the bottom right corner flashed in bright white numbers, indicating a date from exactly 3 weeks ago, precisely 1 day before Cynthia departed for her Hawaiian wellness retreat. The footage showed the interior of my own basement fully illuminated by the harsh overhead utility lights. The camera angle was perfectly positioned in the corner of the ceiling, capturing the entire expanse of the heavy wooden stairs and the concealed storage area. The dining room fell into a deathly paralyzed silence. Every pair of eyes at the table was glued to the glowing screen. On the video, the heavy basement door opened. Cynthia stepped into the frame. She was wearing a dark tracksuit, her hair pulled back into a tight, practical ponytail. But she was not alone. Behind her, slumped heavily on the wooden stairs, was Gavin. The private investigator was completely unconscious, his head rolling limply against his chest, clearly incapacitated by a heavy sedative. The high-definition camera captured every terrifying detail as my wife hooked her arms under his shoulders. We all watched in absolute silence as Cynthia dragged the heavy dead weight of the drugged man down the remaining steps, his shoes scraping loudly against the concrete floor. She did not look panicked. She did not look rushed. She moved with a chilling, methodical calmness. The camera tracked her movements perfectly as she dragged him toward the heavy winter storage shelves. She shoved the massive shelving unit aside with calculated force, exposing the reinforced steel door hidden within the false drywall. She opened the heavy door and dragged the unconscious investigator into the dark, soundproofed subcellar. She reappeared on the screen a few minutes later, stepping back out into the main basement. She pulled the heavy steel door shut. The microphone on the camera picked up the sharp, distinct metallic clicks as she systematically snapped 4 heavy-duty padlocks onto the steel hasps, locking them tight. Once the final padlock was secured, she turned around. She paused for a moment, adjusted the collar of her tracksuit, casually checked her reflection in the glass of a nearby storage cabinet, and walked back up the stairs, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just entombed a living human being. The video feed paused on the final frame of her face. The glow of the television cast a pale, ghostly light over the terrified faces of my family. I turned my attention back to the dining table. Cynthia was physically trembling. She stumbled backward, the back of her knees hitting the edge of her chair. She let out a series of short, shallow gasps, violently hyperventilating as the absolute reality of her situation crushed her chest. The mask of the arrogant, demanding wife was completely obliterated. She was staring at indisputable high-definition proof of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. There was no clever lawyer in the world who could spin or defend the cold, calculated cruelty displayed on that screen. She was not going to get a divorce settlement. She was not going to get alimony. She was going to be locked in a cage. Brian, Amanda, Rachel, and Scott stared at their mother with unblinking, horrified eyes. They had known about the plot to poison me, but physically seeing their mother drag a drugged man into a subterranean prison broke something fundamental inside them. They realized they were not just dealing with a greedy matriarch. They were staring at a ruthless, sociopathic monster. They shrank away from her, pressing their backs against their chairs, desperately trying to put physical distance between themselves and the woman who had just guaranteed her own lengthy prison sentence. Cynthia clutched her chest, her breathing escalating into a frantic, whistling panic attack. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading, opening her mouth to beg, to offer some pathetic excuse or desperate bargain. I held up my hand, silencing her immediately. I spoke with a voice that was soft, but carried the absolute heavy weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. I told her that she would not need a divorce lawyer because she was never going to see the inside of a family court. I explained that she was going to spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a federal penitentiary, surrounded by concrete walls and heavy steel doors, exactly like the one she had used to imprison my investigator. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single terrified member of my parasitic family. I told them I did not just invite them over for a simple family dinner to discuss the estate. I told them that a performance of this magnitude required a proper audience, and that their audience had been waiting patiently just out of sight. The echo of my final words hung in the air of the dining room. I had told them their audience was waiting just out of sight. For a moment, nobody moved. They simply stared at me with hollow, terrified eyes, unable to comprehend the gravity of what was about to happen. Then the heavy, rhythmic sound of tactical boots stepping onto the hardwood floor broke the silence. From the adjacent hallway leading toward the study, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Detective Vargas. His face was a mask of absolute professional stoicism. Behind him stood a team of uniformed police officers, their hands resting securely on their utility belts. They had been standing perfectly still in the darkness of my home for the last hour. They had listened to every single word of the screaming match. They had heard the vicious accusations, the admissions of financial ruin, and the explicit confessions of kidnapping and attempted murder. Detective Vargas did not rush. He walked into the dining room with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had already won the battle. He stopped directly behind the chair where my wife was sitting. Cynthia was completely paralyzed. The breath had left her lungs entirely. She looked up at the detective with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She was a woman who had spent her entire life hiding behind the protective shield of country club memberships and suburban wealth. She truly believed that people in her tax bracket did not face violent legal consequences. Detective Vargas shattered that illusion with a single swift motion. He reached down, grabbing Cynthia by the arms, and hauled her out of the high-backed leather chair. The sound of cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her manicured wrists was the loudest noise in the room. Cynthia let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as her arms were wrenched behind her back. Detective Vargas leaned in close to her ear. His voice was loud, clear, and utterly devoid of sympathy. He informed her that she was under arrest for aggravated kidnapping, false imprisonment, and the attempted murder of Gavin, the private investigator. He began to recite her rights, reading them with a clinical, steady cadence that sealed her doom. Cynthia physically collapsed. Her knees buckled beneath her, and two uniformed officers had to grab her by the shoulders to keep her from hitting the floor. She looked at me across the table, tears streaming down her pale face, begging me silently to make it stop. I simply looked back at her and took another slow sip of my bourbon, but the operation was only half finished. The heavy wooden doors leading from the kitchen swung open violently. A second wave of law enforcement entered the house. These men and women were not wearing local police uniforms. They wore dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was the Financial Crimes Division. They moved with military precision, fanning out across the elegant dining room and surrounding the table. Brian jumped back from his seat, raising his hands in the air, stammering that there had been a massive misunderstanding. A senior federal agent approached Brian and Amanda. He did not ask them to stand. He ordered them to the ground. Brian, the arrogant tech entrepreneur, who thought he was a financial genius, dropped to his knees on the expensive Persian rug. The agent informed Brian that he was under arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The agent listed the specific charges regarding the $3 million venture capital theft and the forged corporate documents. Amanda began to scream hysterically. She tried to pull away from her husband, shouting to the federal agents that she knew nothing about the loans and that Brian had acted entirely alone. Her desperate attempt at self-preservation meant absolutely nothing. An agent secured her wrists in iron, informing her that her personal bank accounts and signature on the fraudulent expenditures made her a fully complicit accessory. At the other end of the table, Scott was already sobbing uncontrollably. He did not even attempt to resist. When a federal agent grabbed his collar and pulled him out of his chair, Scott went completely limp. The agent read him his rights, detailing the $80,000 wire fraud and his illegal transactions with offshore gambling syndicates. Scott wept like a broken child, realizing that the federal government was going to bury him under a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence. Rachel watched her husband being shackled and completely lost her mind. She lunged toward me across the dining table, knocking over crystal wine glasses and expensive porcelain plates. She screamed that I was a monster and that I had set them up to be slaughtered. A female agent caught Rachel by the waist, pulling her back and slamming her down onto the hardwood floor. The agent locked the steel cuffs around the wrists of my daughter, reading her charges of conspiracy and grand larceny. The entire dining room was a scene of absolute spectacular ruin. The catered Italian dinner sat growing cold on the table, surrounded by 5 members of my family, who were now bound in steel. The transition from arrogant heirs to federal prisoners was complete. Detective Vargas gave a sharp command to the officers. It was time to transport the suspects. They hauled Cynthia to her feet, dragging her toward the foyer. The federal agents followed close behind, pulling Brian, Amanda, Rachel, and Scott along the polished floors of the hallway. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly behind them, wanting to witness every single second of their departure. The heavy front doors of my estate were thrown wide open. The quiet, dark suburban night was completely shattered by the blinding flashing lights of a dozen police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles parked across my manicured lawn and sprawling driveway. The red and blue lights reflected wildly off the marble tiles of the foyer. Word of the massive raid had already spread through the affluent neighborhood. The flawless, pristine illusion of the Gallagher family was about to be publicly executed. As the officers dragged my wife and children out onto the front porch, I stepped out directly behind them. I stood on the top step, looking out over the expansive property. The surrounding lawns and sidewalks were packed with people. Every single neighbor from the adjoining estates had stepped out of their homes, drawn by the deafening sirens and the sheer magnitude of the police presence. These were the people Cynthia had spent decades trying to impress. These were the country club presidents, the local politicians, and the wealthy socialites who had attended our summer barbecues and holiday parties. Now they stood on the damp grass, wearing their bathrobes and evening clothes, watching in absolute stunned silence as the matriarch of the Gallagher family was marched down the driveway in handcuffs. Cynthia tried to hide her face behind her messy blonde hair, weeping loudly in profound, unendurable shame. She knew that her reputation, the only thing she truly valued in this world, was dead forever. She would never walk the halls of the country club again. She would be the front-page scandal of every local newspaper and social circle for the next 10 years. Brian and Amanda were marched out next. Brian kept his head down, staring at the asphalt as the flashing police lights illuminated his tear-stained face. Amanda was still screaming at the agents, demanding they let her go, threatening to call her lawyers. Her frantic cries only made the public spectacle more pathetic and undignified. The neighbors whispered to each other, pointing at the disgraced couple as they were shoved into the back of a dark federal transport vehicle. Rachel and Scott followed their faces, completely pale, their spirits entirely broken. They were shoved into a separate cruiser, the heavy metal doors slamming shut with a loud, definitive thud that echoed through the quiet suburban street. In less than 20 minutes, my entire family had been systematically purged from my life. They had walked into my home believing they were the masters of their own destiny. They had believed they were incredibly smart predators executing a flawless financial and physical assassination. In reality, they were nothing more than arrogant, greedy amateurs walking blindly into a steel trap I had designed with mathematical precision. In under 20 minutes, they lost their freedom, they lost their stolen assets, and they lost their carefully curated reputations. They were left with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of their incoming prison sentences. The police cruisers began to back out of the driveway, their sirens silenced, but their lights still spinning violently in the dark. Detective Vargas stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at me and gave a single respectful nod, confirming that the operation was completely successful and the subcellar evidence was fully secured. I nodded back, acknowledging the professional closure of the long nightmare. Vargas climbed into his unmarked vehicle and drove away, following the convoy of federal agents carrying my treacherous bloodline to the county processing center. The neighbors lingered on their lawns for a few minutes longer, staring at my house in silent disbelief. I did not offer them an explanation. I did not wave or speak a single word. I simply turned around and walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home. I closed the heavy front doors and locked the deadbolt. The sudden, absolute silence of the house wrapped around me like a warm, comforting blanket. The toxic, parasitic rot that had infected my life for the past decade was finally completely excised. I walked back into the dining room, poured myself one final generous measure of bourbon, and drank to the absolute perfection of a properly executed adjustment. 6 months have passed since the night the flashing police lights painted my former driveway red and blue. I am sitting on the wrap-around wooden porch of a property I recently purchased in a quiet coastal town in South Carolina. The morning air smells of salt water and damp sand. It is a completely different world from the suffocating, manicured suburbs of my past. I hold a ceramic mug of hot black coffee in my hands. The slight tremor that used to plague my fingers is completely gone. My body has fully purged the heavy metal toxins my wife fed me for nearly a year. My heart beats with a steady, reliable rhythm. I watch the white crests of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline. There are no neighbors whispering behind my back. There are no children plotting my demise across a mahogany dining table. There is only the vast open water and a profound, unbreakable peace. My logistics company continues to generate massive revenue under the protective umbrella of the Blind Trust. I manage the executive decisions from the comfort of my seaside office, never having to step foot in a corporate boardroom again. The justice system is often criticized for moving slowly, but in the case of my family, the legal machinery operated with terrifying speed. There was no need for prolonged, dramatic trials or complex defense strategies. The evidence we presented to the federal prosecutors was an impenetrable fortress of guilt. My corporate attorney, Kenneth, ensured that every single digital ledger audio recording and high-definition video was submitted with flawless legal precision. Cynthia tried to fight. She hired a charismatic defense lawyer using the last of her hidden emergency funds, trying to paint herself as a victim of a dominant, controlling husband. Her pathetic performance completely disintegrated the moment the prosecutors played the video of her dragging an unconscious man into a soundproofed basement vault. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the judge handed down her sentence, Cynthia did not scream or cry. She simply stared straight ahead, completely hollowed out, as the reality of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary finally shattered her arrogant delusions. She will spend the rest of her natural life in a concrete cell, stripped of her designer clothes and her country club status. Her wealthy socialite friends attended the public trial only to watch her downfall with absolute disgust, abandoning her completely. The destruction of my children was equally absolute and utterly merciless. Brian and Amanda did not even make it to their criminal trials with a single penny to their names. The aggressive venture capital firm they defrauded proved with surgical brutality, liquidating every personal asset they possessed before the federal government even filed charges. Their luxury vehicles, their sprawling home, and their remaining tech investments were seized and auctioned off to satisfy the phantom corporate debt. They walked into federal court as completely bankrupt destitutes, facing a judge who had zero patience for greedy heirs committing multi-million-dollar wire fraud. Rachel and Scott met the exact same miserable fate. The federal government seized their properties to cover the offshore gambling liabilities and the illegal wire transfers. My children and their spouses are currently incarcerated in separate federal facilities, serving long mandatory sentences. They spend their days wearing standard prison uniforms, eating cafeteria food, and remembering the lavish, beautiful lives they threw away out of sheer impatience and greed. They thought they were brilliant apex predators, but they were nothing more than foolish, impatient thieves who choked on their own gluttony. Their former friends and business partners treat their names like a contagious disease, completely erasing them from polite society. 2 weeks ago, I traveled back to the city to visit the man who helped me uncover the horrifying truth. Gavin was sitting in the sunny courtyard of a private rehabilitation center, paid for entirely by a secure trust I established in his name. His physical recovery was remarkable. The dark purple bruises that once covered his face had completely faded. He walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were sharp and full of life. We sat on a wooden bench under a large oak tree, sharing a quiet cup of coffee. We did not talk about the dark, cramped subcellar or the heavy steel door. We talked about the future. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a certified cashier check containing a massive financial bonus drawn directly from my restored personal wealth. It was a sum of money large enough to ensure he would never have to work another day in his life. I told Gavin it was not just payment for his investigative services, but a gesture of profound gratitude for his silence, his endurance, and his loyalty. The funds would allow him to retire immediately, purchase a comfortable home in the mountains, and never have to chase another dangerous shadow for the rest of his life. Gavin looked at the check, then looked up at me with tears pooling in his eyes. We shook hands, a silent, permanent agreement between two men who had stared directly into the eyes of monsters and walked away victorious. I take another slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest as I look out over the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The sun is fully above the horizon now, casting brilliant golden light across the water. The seagulls call out in the distance, diving toward the crashing waves. I think about the massive empire I built from nothing, the logistics company that continues to thrive, and the absolute financial security I now hold exclusively in my own name. I did not just survive the violent betrayal of my family. Simply surviving would have meant running away and leaving them to enjoy the spoils of their deceit. I chose a completely different path. I surgically dismantled their greed piece by piece. I let them build a towering house of cards, and then I quietly removed the foundation while they were busy celebrating on the roof. They wanted to erase my existence to satisfy their bottomless hunger. Instead, I erased their freedom, their wealth, and their futures. I sit back in my rocking chair, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean tide. I have proven that anger does not need to be loud to be devastating. I have proven that the most lethal and permanent response to ultimate disrespect is not a screaming match or an explosive physical confrontation. The most lethal response is absolute quiet consequence. The ultimate lesson of George's ordeal is that unconditional love must never equate to unconditional blindness. Society conditions us to believe that family bonds are sacred, but shared blood does not guarantee shared loyalty or respect. When toxic individuals mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for an endless resource, the most powerful defense is not explosive rage, but calculated silent boundaries. True wealth is not defined by corporate empires, but by the peace of mind that comes from severing parasitic ties. Protect your peace, recognize people for who they truly are, and understand that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is simply allowing the greedy to collapse under the absolute weight of their own consequences. If George's ruthless masterclass in setting boundaries resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments how you handle toxic relationships in your own life.